Do you have any history in, like, let's say, scholarly peer review?
No.
Okay. So, but this judgment call was made by you and your personal judgment combined with Justin's personal judgment to cancel grants based on DEI?
Yes.
Okay. Do you think it's inappropriate in any way that someone in their 20s with no experience with grants or federal government was making personal judgment calls about what grants to cancel?
Actually, no, I don't think it's inappropriate.
Okay.
We began with a deposition from Nathan Kavanaugh, a 20-something DOGE staffer on a team tasked with reviewing NEH grants awarded by the Biden administration in 2024 and canceled in 2025. This is the Get Along Little DOGEys edition of the Political Junkie podcast. I'm Claire Potter.
I'm Neil Young.
So I'm going to look first at a really small election that sort of feeds into our general narrative of why are Democrats doing so well in Republican districts. Last weekend, we learned that after a machine recount and then a manual recount, Boca Raton, Florida has its first Democratic mayor in 30 years. Andy Thompson defeated 70-year-old Republican Mike Liebelson by only 5 votes. A key issue the race turned on was Thompson's opposition to a giveaway land deal to a private developer. Liebelson may challenge the results based on his skepticism of what he calls a last-minute dump of 109 mail-in ballots. Now, there was also a third Republican in the race who split the Republican vote. But Neil, what should we be looking at in a tiny mayor's race like this in Florida?
Well, I think just Democrats doing well in a place that obviously for a very long time they haven't won this office, and that this might be an indication of just broader political developments in South Florida that are significant given the enormous population there, how it's often the deciding place for elections statewide. I also think this sort of cuts against a pretty strong narrative of the last 5-6 years, which was that Florida was getting more red because of the population growth from, disaffected Northerners who were moving down because of COVID. And that was actually, even if they weren't necessarily registered Republicans, they were the types of folks who were sort of more conservative leaning and had been maybe radicalized by their COVID experience and were kind of going to put Florida even more firmly in the Republican camp. This news event suggests, along with other recent developments, I think in Florida, suggests that I think there's a bit more of a complicated political story on the ground in this state. If Florida is going to move into the purple camp, I wouldn't go that far at this point, but this seems sort of significant, at least in sort of showing that Florida is not quite as red as it once was.
Yeah, and Neil, I want to pick up on what you're saying about Northerners moving to Florida. I know you are a part-time resident of Florida. I know you grew up in Florida. Do you think these Northerners who came to Florida are perhaps a different kind of Republican? I mean, I'm intrigued about a third Republican in the race when this is a district that went for Kamala Harris by less than a point in 2024. It's not a place where you want to split the Republican vote. Is there some fragmentation in the Florida Republican Party because these are out-of-staters who aren't exactly Floridians?
Well, I think that may be part of it. I'd love to see a little bit more details around the breakdown of these votes. I don't know how much, polling was done here, but, I don't know how much sort of Republican incumbents are actually being maybe hurt by these newer residents in South Florida who are less tied to, incumbents in the position, maybe also just don't share the exact same set of politics that Republican Party does. So perhaps there's a sort of different flavor Republican emerging here that allows for some of the splits here. I do think the the issue here of this land deal, the giveaway land deal to a private developer, is highly, highly relevant. Because what is happening in Florida, especially in South Florida, is lots of panic over real estate. You know, it was boom times, and all the sort of recent data seems to suggest we're about to go into bust times for a lot of South Florida, around, overdevelopment, also really risky development in terms of like environmental issues and all this sort of thing. So I think something like this is probably especially relevant to new residents of the state who paid at the highest rates, right? They came in, they bought at the top of the curve for a lot of these places. A lot of them have been burned by that investment. A lot of them are really worried about what it means that they paid so high, as a lot of predictions are that there's about to be a bubble burst. So I think that's probably really important here as well.
That's really interesting, Neil. Thanks for that local perspective. So let's go to Illinois, where the Democrats are getting their business done. They are sending Lieutenant Governor Juliana Stratton on to the general election as the party's nominee to replace Richard Durbin, who is retiring from the Senate. Winning the Democratic nomination in the state of Illinois is as good as winning the election. When Juliana Stratton is elected, it will be the first time the Senate has 3 Black women serving concurrently. But the other thing is that J.B. Pritzker is the big winner in this as well, and he's kind of behind the scenes. But why are people saying this is a good thing for Pritzker?
I think the fact that this is the first time ever that 3 Black women in this will serve at the same time in the Senate is really remarkable. But back to what you were asking about Governor Pritzker in Illinois. Yeah. He was really behind Stratton. I mean, he financed and promoted Stratton. I think he's, seeing this as his victory as well, in terms of, just being a booster of Stratton's. There's also these reports that AIPAC was engaged in some dark money spending in the state and emerged with mixed results. You know more about that, Claire?
Yeah, I do, actually. Let me preface what I'm about to say by saying we're in a really dicey period here in talking about AIPAC, and our next news item will point to that. So AIPAC has been spending for years quite a lot in races to make sure that people in both parties who are friendly to Israel go to Congress and go to the State House and go to the presidency. AIPAC got a couple of its candidates, and they didn't get another couple of its candidates. And one of the things that it's beginning to look like is that AIPAC's spending can sometimes be detrimental to a candidate. Seth Moulton of Massachusetts, for example, has told AIPAC he will not be accepting their donations. And that's because there is such strong anti-Israel feeling among progressive Democrats in Massachusetts, even though Seth Moulton isn't particularly progressive, but he wants to make sure he can run without that hanging around his neck. What AIPAC also did is they shrouded their spending in other organizations. Again, we have to be really careful about this because this is not atypical of large PACs, is to create these sort of mini PACs that disguise where the spending is coming from. And they can do that because of Citizens United. But right now, of course, we're in a period where over in the Republican Party, and as I say, we're going to talk about that a little bit, there are increasing splits over whether the United States went into this hideous venture in Iran on its own, whether it was surprised by Israel, whether it was dragged in by Israel. We don't really know. So there is an awful lot of talk swirling around the political world about, shall we say, the kind of conspiracy theories that you and I have been spending time on in the last couple weeks.
Yeah, definitely. Ties into the next news item as well.
Yeah, it most certainly does. So this is our last news item of the week, which is quite dramatic. A guy named Joe Kent, who I have to tell you, Neil, I had never heard of before this week, resigned his position as director of the National Counterterrorism Center, citing what he says is the Trump administration's capitulation to Israel's desire for war in Iran. Kent, who some Capitol Hill watchers have described as Groyper adjacent, is a far-right conspiracy theorist who was a controversial pick for the job in the first place. Anti-Semitic MAGA influencers already blame the war on Israeli influence. Some reporting has linked Trump's decision to go to war in Iran to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's February visit. But conspiracy theories have room to fester here, since the administration has yet to define any clear goals or exit plan for the conflict and has offered different explanations for how the joint operation with Israel was agreed upon. Neil, this is a mess. How did Joe Kent make it messier?
Yeah, this is a mess. I think in part he's making it messier by saying things out loud that the Trump administration really doesn't want someone from within to be saying, which is this, claim that that the war in Iran is Israel's doing. That's not a message the Trump administration wants coming from its own. And I think, as you said, it just underscores how little the administration appears to have a plan in place for handling the military objective on the ground, speaking about it publicly, both the sort of military strategy and the communications plan around it. I think a moment like this really just exposes, not that it needed to be exposed, it just sort of underscores again how much the Trump administration doesn't really know what it's doing with this big war it's launched in the Middle East.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's also, the long history of the alliance between the United States and Israel has positioned Israel as the client to the United States. Israel gets more foreign aid than any other country. Much of that foreign aid goes to buying military equipment from our contractors. So there's a kind of circle there. We give them money. They basically give it back. We give them planes and rockets and missiles and so on and so forth. But I would also say that I think there is both disturbance in the MAGA world that Trump absolutely said, I'm not getting into foreign wars, and now he seems to start one every week. And this is a biggie. This one is spreading. It is almost uncontrollable at this point and sort of has the look of World War I. It's like one domino after another is falling. Yeah. I think it's very disturbing to a range of players to think that hauling the United States into this, that the United States has no goal. We're certainly not protecting Israel because Israel is on the attack. So it has normally been our role to protect Israel, and it appears as though Israel is drawing the United States into, if not a forever war, certainly a quagmire that no one in the administration has any idea how to get out of without throwing Israel overboard.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we will return to this. I just want to say one other thing about Joe Kent's letter, Neil, which is he posted it on X. That was the first place that I read it. And it just sort of underscores the role of social media in this administration of allowing, people who are important to unimportant to get ahead of the story and put the Trump administration on its back foot in trying to explain what happened.
Yes, and not at all surprising given who the president is and how, hyper online he is. Sort of starts from the top there.
Yes, it really does. It really does. Okay, so let's get to our news focus, Neil. And our sort of general focus here is the numerous attacks that the Trump administration has made on funding for the arts, institutions, public humanities. But what really triggered our interest in this was the release of depositions from two DOGE staffers. A guy named Nathan Kavanaugh and a guy named Justin Fox. And as it turns out, Justin Fox worked for Nathan Kavanaugh. And they have become the face of the war on scholarship and the arts because they were part of the team and maybe central to the team that canceled all the National Endowment for the Humanities grants made by the Biden administration. Neil, first of all, let's just start with the fact that we live in a world in which a judge has ordered these videos taken down, but actually no one can take them down. Who posted them and why are they still circulating?
Yeah, I mean, the judge's decision was really interesting because in the deliberation, she was saying, like, I'm not really sure there's a basis for doing this because they're under threat. This means they should be taken, just because these guys are getting threats, why does that mean the video should be taken down? Do they not stand by the decisions they've made and the actions they've taken? How did the videos get up? Was this because of the plaintiffs?
Yes, so there were three plaintiffs: the American Council of Learned Societies, the American Historical Association, and the Modern Language Association, which basically covers comparative literature and English literature and so on. And they're really the deepest pockets in the academic world. Our listeners may know that practically every specialty in academia has its own association, and many people belong to several of them. There's a Native American Studies Association, numerous associations. But really, there are only three that have the money to mount this kind of lawsuit. There is a second lawsuit that has been filed against the government by the Authors Guild, and that one is running concurrently. But these videos were on a list of evidence that the judge had previously said was not confidential. So they haven't been posted in any way that was intended to promote a backlash, only intended to explain what the case is about. Now, last week, the AHA, the MLA, and the ACLS filed a motion for summary judgment in the case, which is what you do when you think that the evidence that is already submitted shows that you're going to win anyway, and you want the judge to just make a decision instead of taking the whole thing to trial. So that may be why they posted all this material. I don't know. I haven't talked to anyone at AH.
Yeah, and I think, those videos really resonated deeply with viewers as soon as they saw them. I mean, it's sort of, I guess it shouldn't be surprising, but I think it was really instructive in a lot of ways how quickly those videos went viral. I mean, I was seeing everyone posting about them. I don't think a lot of people usually listen to or watch an hour-long video that's essentially a deposition, but these were like enthralling in a way for, reasons that we'll get into. But it's sort of an unusual thing to, I think, go viral in the way that it did, given how long it is and sort of, in a lot of ways, how sort of, not boring, but just, sort of how plotting a lot of the video is.
Right. Well, I listened to Justin Fox's a couple sections. Both of them testified or were deposed for hours. So I could only listen to portions of them. But of course, what we've seen online is, snippets that are a minute and a half and so on. So one of the things we have to say, listeners, is that all that you've seen is a 90-minute clip from these videos that gives you something particularly juicy. There is wider context. That being said, neither one of them appeared to know much about what they were doing. And at the same time, they kept insisting that they were perfectly well qualified to do it. What were the things that they had trouble with, but just sort of kept going regardless, Neil?
Well, the big one was saying what they believed DEI to mean. Justin Fox continued to say, well, DEI meant what it was stated in the executive order. We were given a definition of it, and so that's what DEI is. And then he was asked to recall what that was and said that he couldn't explain it. So it was this sort of circularity in his responses where he kept referring to, well, there was a defining term here, but I'm like, okay, well then what was the definition? Well, I don't recall what it was.
Right.
And I think there was both a sort of ignorance and an arrogance that were so apparent, particularly in that exchange. You just got this sense that, and I couldn't tell at first if it was like he didn't want to go on record sort of saying what he really believed it to be. What came through for me was more not sort of a cautiousness, but just really an ignorance on his part, and that these guys were just sort of given tasks that were way beyond their understanding and attacking it with like a pretty big hatchet.
Right, right. Well, one of the things they did, and this, of course, went viral across the internet, was they fed all these NEH grants. And we should probably pause to talk about what goes into these grants. But they fed all these grants into ChatGPT and asked them, is there DEI in this grant? And ChatGPT would either say yes or no, but the bulk of them, ChatGPT said yes, there is DEI in this grant. So there are sort of two criteria here that are colliding. One is Donald Trump's executive order that says we will not have DEI anymore. And then there's ChatGPT's definition of what DEI is. And we don't know actually what ChatGPT thinks DEI is, but they were using this tool. And of course, that's particularly interesting at a moment when academics across the nation are freaking out about their students' use of artificial intelligence to do all of their assignments. The idea that there are these tech bros evaluating their grants with artificial intelligence is crazy, ironic, infuriating.
Yeah, I don't know if you saw it, but Benjamin Park, who's a historian and a friend of ours, a really prolific writer, he had this post, he put it on a lot of his social media accounts, where one of the things he pointed out, and I took a screenshot of it, I want to sort of quote from it a little bit, was that, he really sort of put his finger on something that I think I didn't see others really saying in their commentary, which is like, he says, what I keep thinking about is the juxtaposition between their blasé disregard and unearned confidence on the one hand, and the hours of labor that actually go into not only the NEH funding applications themselves, like all the time that someone spends on putting an application together. I know I've done it before, and it's like weeks really of work. So not only the NEH funding applications themselves, but the laborious analysis performed by reviewers on the other. And I thought that was a really smart point that really relates to what you just said, right? They're loading this thing into ChatGPT, they're giving it a few words or a few commands to do some sort of search, and then they're just axing stuff that's costing people really needed money for the work that they want to do, juxtaposed against how these things are normally assessed by fellow scholars who spend hours and hours and hours carefully reviewing them, thinking about them really deeply, and then determining, whether or not they received the funding in the first point. And so I just think that that's a really smart and important observation here that ties into probably a lot of the themes we want to develop here about both, white male arrogance, but also the reliance here on technology and a sort of Silicon Valley ethos that's really prominent in this administration that, has a particular valence in the manosphere, and how these things sort of reinforce one another.
Right. No, that's all a very good point. And I read Benjamin Park's link, the various social media posts that he wrote too, and we're going to link to that, listeners. And I just want to keep pausing on the work that goes into these grants for a second and just sort of delineate. When you file an NEH grant, you have to file a proposal. You have to file a 2-page CV. You have to file a bibliography. You have to file sources. And all of these things have to be done in a minute number of words. So a lot of the time that you spend writing an NEH grant, you are spending rewriting it and cutting it and boiling it down so that you actually suit the criteria that has been asked for. I mean, if you send in a grant that's too long, they just throw it away. What then happens is there are 3 people who write recommendations. So other people who take hours, reading your work and making a recommendation. Then it goes to the first committee, a committee of experts in each field. There's a whole series of subcommittees. They forward the finalists to a central committee who then awards the grants. And they, in fact, all of these people have to write reports so that if you have filed one of these grants and you don't get it, by federal law, you can actually go to the government and ask them for the reports on your grant so that you can refile it the next year and do it better. On top of all of this, there's the staff at the National Endowment for the Humanities who is available to you. They run information sessions online, but there's a whole period of time in which you can send your grant to the staff at the NEH, and they will read it and comment on it and tell you how to do better. So the other thing I would like to say is that there are several different kinds of NEH grants. One is for individual research projects. There's two programs, at least two programs for that. But there are also institutional programs. There are ongoing, there's one for film and media and so on. So one of the things that happens when these are canceled is it's not just, your disappointed scholar neighbor who can't take the semester off to finish her book. It's really big projects. People like Ken Burns, right, have to find other funding. So the ramifications of this in lost labor and in lost product, because that's really what this is about, is to enrich our culture. So let's roll back. How do we account for the contempt and the hostility that was exhibited by these young men?
Well, I think that there's a number of things going on here that converge. I mean, one, there's sort of a panic about white men and sort of their, in a lot of conservatives' estimation, their declining power and sort of their vulnerability. And, this is expressed in all sorts of different ways. In the job force, things about concern about, lack of men in college level humanities courses, like all those sorts of things. At the same time, we have a very concerted attack on those fields of the humanities that characterize them as inherently soft, as pointless, as liberal, as radical, as not leading to careers, but serving to radicalize young people and make them woke and all the rest. So I think all of that is at work. I mean, there's also a longer history of conservatives just believing things like the NEH shouldn't be funded to begin with. So I think that is, that sort of takes us outside of our current moment and attaches us to a longer history of a sort of pretty traditional conservative project to, not fund things like this. But I think all of this sort of got really weaponized isn't the right word, but all of that got sort of, I think, really accelerated quickly when you have someone like Elon Musk put in charge of Doge, and this idea that they could go through and just make cuts here and there that were going to make, the government more efficient. I mean, something like this is seen in the conservative imagination as being like the opposite of efficiency, right? Like an agency like this or an organization like this. What else do you think is at work in this contempt and hostility?
Well, I think everything you're saying is really important. I think we also have to add the utter confidence that many people have in who work in the tech world in what they do. There has been really since the 70s this kind of overwhelming self-confidence that technology is going to make us all better and smarter and happier and everything will be cheaper. I mean, we even saw this in universities in the 90s. When I got my first email account, they fired all these secretaries, right? And that had huge ramifications for the university, for how we related to each other as colleagues and so on. But this idea that technology is always the best solution, and you see this sort of evolving at very high levels in the tech world in people like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk, planning to create colonies in other places entirely where life is going to be perfect and they will be protected from everything. So, Peter Thiel has this idea about creating floating islands out in the ocean that won't be governed by anybody and will be a libertarian paradise. Elon Musk has this whole fantasy about building colonies on Mars, and he keeps saying, we're going to be on Mars and I'm going to build there. And, again, a libertarian paradise. So these very young men have gone to work with people who are like them, white men who are super duper smart, and have really, in some ways, lost touch with the world that they actually live in. This is where you mentioned the lack of men in college levels humanity courses. I think it's the kind of thing universities need to be thinking about rather than bowing down to AI and tech and saying we have to feed all of our students into this, is to think more deeply about the relationship between the humanities and technology, and how, without the humanities, you don't really have AI. I mean, what are you going to put in it if you don't have people writing and speaking and making films and so on? So I think there's that. I think what you're saying about masculinity is really important. I thought these depositions were a real window on the real impact of the manosphere on politics and governments. Am I on base there?
I think that's exactly right. I mean, just to sort of situate the manosphere in this conversation, I mean, that's sort of really been around for, I would say, 10, 15 years as a term. This, it's the world of these, bro podcasters and the social media influencers who just like peddle misogyny and white male dominance as their like around the clock content. And I think it's worth sort of, putting a finger on that word peddling, because this is a business. It's a big business, and it's made, some folks like Joe Rogan enormously wealthy. And so that's important to remember, even as we talk about what it means as a sort of political movement and having political consequence. But I think, maybe one of the most important or most central themes of that world is that white men are aggrieved, that they've been pushed aside, that they're the most discriminated against demographic there is in this nation, that they've been sort of pushed off their rightful perch, and that this movement exists to regain that position. And so I think that's why you have, these programming their chat GPT to search for words like gay and BIPOC and indigenous and women,
Right.
Because they think that like those are the categories that like seek to replace them. And if we can remove them, we can sort of fix public life and public order. I just have to point out this one thing that there's so much that's really quotable in the testimony of these two guys. One of them, Fox, actually was asked, he was really struggling, again, as we talked about, to define what DEI was, and he was asked whether he considered a documentary about Jewish women during the Holocaust to be DEI. And he said, well, and this is a direct quote, "It's a specifically focused on Jewish culture and amplifying the marginalized voices of the females in that culture. It's inherently related to DEI for that reason." He's being asked about the Holocaust, right? But like, if what you're doing is searching for anything that is not white male, then it leads you to a result where you're eliminating a documentary on the Holocaust, because that, falls under this enormous umbrella of wokeness.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and, you and I both, you took a look at the transcript of this interview that Ross Douthat did with Jeremy Carl of the Claremont Institute, who is actually a perfect example of this. I sort of dug into who Jeremy Carl is. He worked in the first Trump administration, and he was nominated to work with, I think, the UN in the second Trump term. And even Republicans on the committee that was vetting him thought he was a white supremacist. And he was like, no, you've got me all wrong. And he's written this book in which he argues that national diversity initiatives of any kind, and in fact, diversity itself, like letting immigrants into the country, is inherently discriminatory toward white people, men, and Christians. And I think, as ridiculous as this sounds, we have to take it seriously if there are people like Jeremy Carl who are rising to the highest levels of government. But the reason he's actually a good example of this is he has absolutely no background in diversity, in higher education, in immigration, in any of the things that he wrote about in this book. And he talks about it as his pivot, but he spent most of his life as an economist and looking at agriculture around the globe. And, he had a whole different specialty entirely, but he became moved because of his politics to take a stand against diversity. Couple things that were interesting about this interview, one of which is that Carl could never really answer a question. So Ross Douthat would say, well, the elimination of affirmative action in universities has meant, for example, that Asian Americans and Asians have spiked in terms of admissions to elite universities, and actually the admissions of white students has either flatlined or fallen. And, a recent figure I heard from Harvard was that their entering class was going to be 30% white and something like 50% Asian and Asian American, right? And so what Jeremy Carl says about this is, well, the only reason that this lawsuit featured Asian Americans was that the plaintiffs were afraid that if they didn't put people of color on the stand, the judge wouldn't pay any attention to them at all. But now we've created this situation where white people are being discriminated against in favor of Asian Americans. And Ross Douthat was like, maybe that group, Asian Americans actually do test better than almost any other demographic group. And Douthat was saying, well, maybe actually they're more meritorious. And the guy's like, no, that's not it. When you see that kind of imbalance, there's got to be discrimination. Right? So we've got this world in which people who are not experts in any of this, who don't actually care about the nuts and bolts of culture or education, are saying, nevertheless, I have the authority to make policy. But one of the things, I think it was Fox who was questioned about what he knew about the humanities, and he said, I've read books. Neil, how did that make any sense at all?
Well, I think there is just this, and the manosphere has, emphasized this over and over the last 10 to 15 years, that the sort of inherent strength and the inherent qualifications of being a white man, rather that being a white man sort of has its own inherent qualifications for power and for position. And so, I think there's just this sort of brazen confidence that I think is really apparent in these video testimonies of a sort of male prestige or a male authority that doesn't need a lot of education or training or specialization, or I think an important word here is expertise, in order to make these evaluations. And all of this, of course, is connected to the idea that women, African Americans, LGBTQ people, on and on, that they have been unfairly promoted.
Right.
And so you have these things working together, right? There's an unfair promotion that's happened that has created these situations that men have been kept from. And by virtue of being white men, they sort of inherently have the knowledge and intelligence to dominate these spaces. I also think that there's just something that's like very unapologetic about what Fox and the others are doing. And I think that's the thing that I can't totally figure out, right? When he's saying, I've read a couple of books, is he saying that's sufficient knowledge for this?
Right.
Or is he also saying, I've read a couple books and it's a little FU to such questions? I think maybe it's a little bit of both. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, yes. And, then the lawyer who was deposing him said, well, have you read books about grants and grant making and the humanities? And he said no. So, when pressed, the thinness of such a response became perfectly obvious. But then also there were other ways in which these guys were evincing a value system, not one that I agree with, but there is a value system there. Both of them said, I believed strongly in President Trump's executive order, and we're linking to it, listeners. It's called the Ending Radical and Wasteful Government DEI Programs and Preferencing. They said they believed in that And then they also said that they believed strongly that the federal deficit was out of control and they saw it as an important mission to bring it into control. And then the lawyer would say, well, do you think you succeeded? And there would be this long pause and they would say, no. So there is this sort of disjuncture between what might be the kind of thing that you could say, all right, I understand you believe in this, but if you're so smart, why did you not understand that cutting $250 million would not address a deficit in the hundreds of trillions?
Yeah. And I mean, it seems worth just bringing into the conversation the news of just, I think, this morning that Pete Hegseth is asking for $200 billion to, fund the war in Iran. So just the sort of dollar amounts that we're talking about and just the small percentage that something like NEH represents. And yet the attachment to attacking it, I mean, like we said, this has been a conservative goal for a very long time, but it seems especially worth noting that these guys are sort of speaking about bringing a hyper rationality to what they're doing, right? We're going to involve technology here to like search out waste, and we're going to and we're committed to this plan to reduce the deficit and to cut government spending. And it's like, but this doesn't amount to a hill of beans in that deficit and in those spending totals. I think that what this is really about is not the dollars that were devoted to these things, but what they represented. And especially that seems clear when we think about what the Trump administration is doing when it comes to the version of history and patriotism that it's promoting.
Right. And listeners, we're going to link to another Trump executive order called Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History, which reflects actually something that's not unique to Trump, but a long-standing conservative commitment to events, political actors, and historical myths that valorize conquest, whiteness, and masculinity, and that sort of underlie events like the war in Iran. Like, if the United States is doing it, it must be good because everybody else is bad. And I think what you're saying there, Neil, really taps into two things. One is that Jeremy Carl interview, which I think everybody should read. Carl's basic argument, which is not unique on the far right, is that the problem with immigration, the problem with all of these different histories on the margins coming to the center, is that you can't have a nation unless you have a unified culture. And that unified culture is contained in things like history and literature and so on. And it really sort of pulls all the threads together, not just of what we're talking about today, but, Ron DeSantis' tax on the freedom to read in Florida, Governor Abbott in Texas, his attacks on the freedom to read and the freedom to teach in Texas, and so on. That if in fact you suppress everything that we have learned about the United States in the last 60 or 70 years, everything will be peaceful and everyone will get along because we will all agree on a central story. One of Trump's contributions to this, and this is also where the whole idea of cutting the budget is put in contrast to what's really happening with this money, not just the $200 billion for war, but Trump announced shortly after these grants were cut that he was redirecting the funding to what he called the National Garden of American Heroes. I think we talked about that in another episode. Which is supposed to open in Washington as part of the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Do you think it will, Neil?
It's not going to. Apparently, it's not even a site picked out. Politico has also said that there were not enough artists in the country to complete a project this big within the time that they were allotted. I also think it's sort of, actually, if you look at I don't know if you looked at the list of like available American heroes that there are, right? Like there's a long list. It's a very odd list. Yeah, it really runs the gamut. It's a little, to use a word, more diverse than I actually would have expected. Now, I think you can sort of take a bird's eye view of it and say, well, this is sort of, no one here is all that controversial.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that this is like, you can almost imagine Trump like rattling off a bunch of names, famous names that he knew, is like what created a good chunk of this list. But yeah, it doesn't look like that's going to happen. But I also think it's like the National Garden of American Heroes, this notion of heroism as the thing that the Trump administration is single-handedly restoring to our ideas of what this nation is, and that this is in opposition to what like the woke liberal academy has done, to denigrate this nation, to tell a story of it being this place of oppression and of all the rest. I mean, it just sort of, it's such an evocative name, such an evocative title that really, I think, just underscores sort of some real notions here about what history is, what the nation is, and what it means to be patriotic, and how, a federal, or how a presidential administration can direct that.
Well, I'm going to really go out on a limb and say I actually think they put that list together using ChatGPT.
That seems
I mean,
right.
a lot of the lawsuits that are coming, a lot of the legal filings that are coming out of the Department of Justice, it's perfectly clear that they're using AI. And judges will just say that. I mean, because there are so many mistakes in these filings, and it's the one thing you are trained not to do as an attorney is even make a punctuation mistake or a spelling error. And they're just filing all this slop. But my guess is, he sort of farmed it out to one of his interns or staffers. And this is the way I think also Kavanaugh and Fox feed back into the larger Trump administration. Really, the people who seem to be doing the work in that administration are 20 and 30 something men. And I think it's part of why the messaging is so crazy and wonky is they have all of these guys who are like groypers and internet trolls and so on, running the social media account for Homeland Security. But I think Trump farmed this job out to someone who sourced it on ChatGPT because the list makes absolutely no sense. And the project makes no sense. I mean, if you were a proper president, whether you were a liberal or a conservative, you would put together a committee, and that committee would come up with the names. But that would probably take, 6 months or a year, and they didn't have that. They needed it overnight. It's also true, as you're saying, that ChatGPT doesn't make sculptures, so you can't necessarily get all of these statues right away. I agree with you. National Garden of American Heroes is just hilarious. I mean, it sounds like the Garden of Eden or something like that. But before we move on to our next section, Neil, I would also like to just sort of bring in the failure of the attempts to rebrand the Kennedy Center. What has happened there?
Well, the programming has been just completely gutted because one artist after another canceled their appearance at the Kennedy Center because of, Trump's renaming of it. And not surprising that, a lot of performers just didn't want to attach their name to this place, as someone else was attaching his name to it. And so, that's been a disaster for the center. Rick Grinnell, who was appointed by Trump to lead the Kennedy Center, and another guy, no background in artistic performing, right? I mean, he's a gay man.
Right.
And you have to think that was probably part of Trump's, wild internal logic around this. But like, this is a foreign policy expert who all of a sudden now is like making decisions about the Christmas program at the Kennedy Center. And, I would say Rick Grinnell is also a right-wing flamethrower and sort of loved to, I mean, maybe this was a credential of his, he loved to engage culture war stuff. And the Trump administration saw the Kennedy Center as like one of the next fronts in a culture war that it could launch. But he has now been fired. Although Trump has said he hasn't been fired, he just is no longer in the job. And now the latest is that the administration is closing the building because it's going to renovate it for the next 2 years. And I think that that's a dodge, that allows Trump to sort of beat his chest and say, remember, guys, I'm the construction expert here. And I know that this building needs to be, overhauled. And also it puts the building out of commission for 2 years and sort of puts these issues to the side.
Right. And, my guess is it won't be renovated and it won't be reopened until we have another president.
That's right.
I want to come back to Rick Grinnell just for a second, because I think he really calls attention to this whole attempt to establish a national culture that is not diverse, that does not represent all the people here and only represents a white Christian past. Because I've seen Rick Grinnell interviewed a couple of times on the PBS NewsHour, and Amna Nawaz will ask him a very, very specific question about the Kennedy Center, and he will respond by going on a rant about DEI. And it's really very transparent that he knew nothing about the arts. And you would think that somebody who was intelligent could at least hire the people he needed to do the work. But I think the artist boycott was very, very effective. And what's is striking to me is the Trump administration generally tries to fill in the gaps with various second-rate country music artists. And apparently either they decided that was a bridge too far for the Kennedy Center, or country music artists, most of whom do not want to get involved in politics, said no, they were not going to step in and fix this. But I think, Rick Grinnell, you're right, of course, he is a foreign policy expert. He was ambassador to Germany in the first administration, which is a huge job. And what I understand is that he had hoped to be Secretary of State, and that Trump, who, can we say, has lots of gay friends, thought that a gay man in that role was impossible and he would not do it. And that's partly how Marco Rubio ended up there, or that's partly how the field was cleared for Marco Rubio. So Rick Grinnell has really gotten the shaft here, and I can't think of anybody who really deserved it more. So, Neil, let's move on to our next segment, which is what we want to go viral this week. What do you want to go viral this week?
All right, turning a page a little bit here. I don't think I've talked all that much on here about my very favorite thing in the world, which are dogs. But there's a wonderful article in the New Yorker, came out a couple days ago, titled "How Doodles Became the Dog du Jour" by John.
I so want to read that.
It's
great. I have one. I have a doodle.
You do? Yes.
Yes.
So you and
Speak.
millions and millions of other Americans. Doodles, of course, are when two breeds, one of which is a poodle, is combined with another AKC, American Kennel Club recognized breed. The two biggest are the Labradoodle and the Golden Doodle, right? So Labrador Poodle and a Golden Retriever Doodle. And these did not exist 30 years ago, but over the course of 30 years, these have absolutely exploded in popularity. Doodles of all types, but particularly the Labradoodle and the Golden Doodle. And the article sort of traces the development of that. Sort of the origins of this breed was really around creating a hypoallergenic dog, which was important for lots and lots of Americans, including myself, who's very allergic to animals, but wants to have dogs in my house, although I don't have a doodle. But, so it was sort of created for that purpose. Their appeal comes from a word that is always associated with them, their cuteness, but also their friendly temperament, the fact that they, their coats don't shed. And one of the things that this piece does that I think is really interesting is it charts this sort of unusual history in that the rise of the doodle happens at the exact moment in which purebreds fall out of favor for Americans, right? Purebreds had really dominated Americans' ideas about dogs and also their ownership trends for much of the 20th century. That starts to fall apart in the 1990s with concerns about overbreeding, concerns about, the poor sort of health conditions for overbred purebreeds, and also this movement to sort of rescue dogs, the sort of shelter movement, the adopt, don't shop philosophy, all those things. So that's happening at the very moment in which the Labradoodle rises in popularity. And so there's a really interesting sort of way that the Labradoodle allows us to explore some really important cultural shifts around Americans' relationships to animals, and particularly to dogs, that this piece goes into. And I think I'll just sort of leave it as at that, but to also say that this piece really touches on how dogs exist in American life as an extension of their owner's identity, and how that becomes particularly I think apparent through the example of the doodle, this piece really nicely investigates and explores. So read it in the New Yorker. There's some cute pictures of doodles in there as well. And I don't know, pet your dog while you're doing it.
That's fantastic, Neil. Yeah, we have a cockapoo, and I would have to say the poodle is responsible in many ways for giving a kind of intelligence and intuition into the mix that the other half tends not to have. So, Zephyr, who is behind me back here, otherwise known as Zephyr Doozy Barnes Potter, Zephyr is an extremely intuitive dog, and her father was a spaniel. And I can attest that spaniels are lovely, lovely dogs, and they're dumb as rocks. You add a little poodle in there, and you get just enough intelligence to sort of like lift the boat a little bit. But it's also the case that all of these dogs come in different sizes, and I'll be interested to read the article because, of course, there is this sort of trend in many, many forms of consumer capitalism toward customization of, getting the thing that is exactly right for your lifestyle. So, you can get teacup cockapoos, you can get, large golden doodles, you can get small golden doodles. You can really just sort of say, here's what I need in a dog, and then find the breeder that's making that dog, which I'm sure that the animal rights people have something to say about that, but they are great dogs. Thank you, Neil. We'll do more dogs on this show. We need more dogs in this culture.
Definitely.
So this week, I actually also want you to read something upbeat about something that's been very hard, which is an essay by Thomas Friedman in the New York Times called How Minnesota Beat Trump. And it's an extremely hopeful set of observations about how one idea, and that idea is called neighborliness, knitted a diverse community together to protect vulnerable people against an out-of-control federal policing campaign against immigrants. And I liked it for two reasons. One is we're all still living with and thinking about the book Bowling Alone. Robert Putnam, a sociologist at Harvard, who wrote about how our social institutions kind of fell apart in the 1990s, that people who used to go to bowling leagues, there were no more bowling leagues. And, the ways to make and maintain friendships and communities within our communities had fallen apart. People had stopped going to church. People had stopped volunteering to run Boy Scout troops, just a range of things. And probably a great deal of this had to do with the fact that more and more families needed to have two parents in the workforce, that mothers were no longer around to do a lot of that, but that fathers were also working harder, sometimes working two jobs, and so on. So we've been living with this sort of burden of why don't people care about each other anymore? And then the flip side is, what people sort of say somewhat disparagingly about Minnesota, which is there is this thing called Minnesota nice.
Yeah.
And that people seem nice, but they're actually not really nice. They act nice in public, but don't count on them for anything. And one of the things Friedman got from the people he interviewed, the organizers he interviewed, is that something really important shifted around the death of George Floyd. And that the Black Lives Matter campaign really jolted whites in the city into understanding that there was something wrong and that they needed to participate. Now, Friedman doesn't talk about something else that I think is probably really important in this, which is the very high degree of religiosity in the Twin Cities, and that many of the immigrants that came to the Twin Cities were brought there by churches and religious networks. So the churches have a great deal to do with it. But what Friedman basically says is that Trump and the Trump administration's idea that everybody is out for themselves is what they predicated their campaign on. And that wasn't true. Mm-hmm. And Minnesotans invested in looking out for each other. I kind of want everybody to read this because I think we should take a look around and see whether our own communities are promoting neighborliness. And if they're not, how do we do that? Mm-hmm. Because it is the effective way to respond to autocracy in Friedman's view.
I love that. That's so uplifting.
Thank
I haven't read that, but I'm excited to do so.
Yeah, it is very uplifting. And Friedman every once in a while just kind of hits the nail on the head. This is one of them. So Neil, on this hopeful note with Doodles and Neighbors, I think we're at the end of the show. So thank you so much, and I'll see you next week.
See you next week.
That's it for today's show. Thanks for hanging out with us. Share this podcast with a friend who loves history, politics, and smart conversation. You can follow Neil and me on Threads, Blue Sky, X, TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram. Go to the Political Junkie Substack at clairepotter.substack.com for show notes, more episodes, to leave a comment or question, to subscribe for free, or to support our work for as little as $5 a month. You can also subscribe for free by searching for us on your favorite podcast platform. If you do, please leave a rating and a comment so that other listeners can find us. Our podcast is supported by the New School for Social Research and by paying subscribers. Political Junkie is written, recorded, edited, and produced by me, Claire Potter. Today's theme is Billionaires by Lindo. You can find their work and all the talented artists we feature on these episodes on Soundstripe. That's all for now. See you next week.